Whisper Creek Studios.
Memorial Day usually brings images of cemeteries, marble monuments, and names carved into stone. But in Appalachia, a lot of the heroes came from places where the roads were narrow. The towns were small and hard living to find folks from an early age. Coal camps, Cherokee communities, mountain farms tucked back into the hollows. This week, we're telling the stories of Appalachian men and women who carried that mountain grit into some of the darkest moments in modern history. And in some cases, they never came home. Before we get into this episode, if you're drawn to true stories from Appalachia, the kind rooted in history, folklore, crime, and things that people don't always say out loud, then you're in the right place. This is Roots and Shadows, the Real Appalachia podcast. We release new episodes every Saturday. If you decide to stay, go ahead and press that follow button. That way these stories don't have to come looking for you. Memorial Day and Veterans Day sometimes get talked about like they're the same thing, but they're really not. Veterans Day is about honoring everyone who served. Memorial Day is different. Memorial Day, once called Decoration Day, is about the ones who never made it back home, the ones who left and gave everything they had and died in service to our country. And if there's one thing Appalachia has always done, it sends its sons and daughters into service. Per capita, these mountains have consistently produced some of the highest military service rates anywhere in the United States. Maybe part of that comes from patriotism. Maybe part of it comes from family tradition. And maybe part of it comes from the kind of hard living that teaches people early about sacrifice, duty, and looking after the people beside you. In Appalachia, military service has always run deep. You'll find folded flags hanging in living rooms, old photographs in uniforms tucked away in dresser drawers, names etched into courthouse monuments, and stories that still get told generations later. This week, we're going to talk about a few of those service members, and honestly, narrowing it down wasn't easy, because there's hundreds, probably thousands, of Appalachian men and women whose stories could be told in an episode like this. Some fought in the mud and snow on foreign battlefields. Some carried wounded soldiers to safety. Some gave the ultimate sacrifice and never made it home. These are just a few of the heroic stories we highlight and remember this Memorial Day. The first person we're going to talk about is somebody that, honestly, a lot of people have probably never heard of unless they're really into military history. Ruby Bradley was born in 1907 near Spencer, West Virginia, during a time when much of Appalachia still felt pretty isolated from the rest of the country. People worked hard, helped each other out when they could, and learned early how to make something out of almost nothing. And from just about everything people later said about Ruby Bradley, that mountain toughness stayed with her for the rest of her life. She eventually went into nursing, and after joining the Army Nurse Corps, she found herself stationed in the Philippines. A dream posting, a tropical paradise where off-duty nurses would spend their time enjoying the beautiful beaches and weather. And Ruby was one of those nurses who was far away from everything she had ever known, right as one of the deadliest wars in human history was beginning to unfold, as that dream was about to come to an end. On December 7th, 1941, the Imperial Japanese attacked the U.S. Naval Base, Pearl Harbor, in Hawaii. Within hours of Japan attacking Pearl Harbor, not days, hours, Japanese aircraft struck Camp John Hay where Ruby was stationed. Japan dropped 128 bombs on the installation. Fortunately, many didn't detonate. But the ones that did were bad enough. Within days of the attack, Japanese forces were rapidly pushing through the Pacific, and American forces in the Philippines suddenly found themselves trapped in a collapsing situation. Hospitals overflowed with wounded soldiers. Medical supplies became harder to find. Fear and uncertainty was spreading. And before long, Ruby Bradley and dozens of other American nurses were captured by the Japanese forces and taken prisoner. Now, when most people think about prisoners of war during World War II, they usually think soldiers. They don't think about nurses trapped inside prison camps, trying to keep the sick and wounded people alive with almost nothing to work with. But that's exactly where Ruby found herself. She would eventually be taken to Santo Tomas Internment Camp in Manila, where conditions became worse as the war dragged on. Food shortages grew severe. Disease spread through the camp. Medicine became scarce. Prisoners lost dangerous amounts of weight just trying to survive. And what's remarkable about Ruby is that almost every story told about her during those years in that camp basically said the same thing. Somehow, she just kept working. While prisoners around her were exhausted, starving, and losing hope, Ruby continued caring for patients however she could. She assisted surgeries using primitive tools. She treated sick prisoners. She comforted dying soldiers. And somehow, in the middle of all that suffering, she still carried this deep sense of responsibility toward the people around her. And honestly, that part especially feels familiar in Appalachia, because most people who grew up around these mountains probably knew somebody like that at some point. Someone struggling themselves, but still showing up to help when somebody else needed it. People who didn't complain much. They just carried what needed carrying. And as the war in the Pacific grew darker, Ruby Bradley kept doing exactly that. As the months turned into years inside the prison camp, survival became harder and harder. Food was so scarce that prisoners were constantly hungry. Disease spread quickly through overcrowded conditions. Medical supplies were now almost non-existent, and people inside the camp were slowly wasting away. But Ruby Bradley developed a reputation among the prisoners for refusing to give up. She reportedly smuggled medical supplies into the camp whenever she could, sometimes hiding them under her clothing and in her hair. And somehow, during her time in captivity, she helped assist in the delivery of 13 babies, born right there inside the prison camp. Just imagine that for a second. In the middle of a war, in a prison camp, surrounded by sickness and starvation, this woman from Appalachia was still helping bring life into the world. And over time, some of the prisoners began calling her the Angel in Fatigues. And eventually, American forces liberated the camp in 1945. And when soldiers arrived, they found prisoners in horrific condition. Ruby Bradley herself was one of them. She had become dangerously thin from years of malnutrition, weighing only 86 pounds. But even then, she refused to leave immediately because she was still helping care for patients and making sure others were evacuated first. And honestly, that tells you just about everything you need to know about who Ruby Bradley was. A lot of people, after surviving something like that, probably would have gone home and never looked back. But Ruby Bradley didn't. She stayed in the Army, and after a few years later, during the Korean War, she once again found herself near the front lines, serving at an evacuation hospital as wounded soldiers poured in from combat zones. And just like before, war eventually caught up with her again. During one enemy advance, her hospital came under threat, and evacuation orders were given. Snipers were nearby. As fighting was breaking out, medical staff scrambled to move wounded soldiers to safety. But Ruby once again refused to leave until every wounded American soldier had been loaded onto evacuation planes, as she was the last one to get on board herself. And maybe that's why her story still stands out after all these years. Because when people talk about courage, they usually picture somebody charging into gunfire with a rifle in their hands. And that absolutely takes courage. But there's another kind too. The kind that keeps showing up day after day in terrible places, carrying other people through fear, pain, sickness, and hopelessness. And somehow, this woman from the mountains of West Virginia kept doing exactly that through 2 different wars. And after everything, she survived. Ruby eventually retired from the Army as a colonel, become the most decorated woman in the United States military history. And she still carries that honor today. 34 medals and citations, 2 Legions of Merit, 2 Bronze Stars, the Florence Nightingale Medal from the International Red Cross. But even after all that, she eventually made her way back home to Appalachia. She spent part of her later years in West Virginia, not far from the mountains where her story first began, still working in nursing, and later in life she had relocated to Hazard, Kentucky, where she died of natural causes in 2002 at the age of 94. A woman who had survived prison camps, starvation, 2 different wars, and some of the darkest moments of the 20th century, lived long enough to see an entirely different world than the one she was born in the West Virginia hills in 1907. And after her death, she was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, among presidents, generals, war heroes, and thousands of American servicemen and women who carried the weight of war long after the fighting stopped. Most people still don't know her name, and somehow I think she'd be fine with that. Because people like Ruby Bradley weren't the ones looking for attention. They were just the ones caring more than most people ever knew. Our next story takes us into the mountains of southwestern Virginia, into the coal fields of Wise County, where hard living and hard work shaped just about everyone who grew up there during the early 1900s. Junior J. Spurrier was born in Russell County, Virginia, around Castlewood in 1922, though he would later grow up around St. Paul, Virginia, in Wise County. And like a lot of boys growing up in Appalachia during that time, life wasn't easy. Coal country could be rough. Families worked hard. Kids learned responsibility at an early age, and people around there developed a reputation for being independent, stubborn, and not easily intimidated. And from everything later said about Junior Spurrier, he fit that description quite well. After his mother died in 1940, Spurrier, who had tried farming and working for the Civilian Conservation Corps, decided to enlist in the United States Army, where he had a hard time adjusting to the discipline of Army life. Then not long after, the United States entered World War II on December 8, 1941, the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Spurrier found himself right in the middle, being deployed to the South Pacific Theater as an infantry soldier. He was wounded in the fall of 1943 in New Guinea and returned to the United States to recover, and after a short leave home, he volunteered, that's right, he volunteered to return to combat duty. Upon his return to duty, he joined the 134th Infantry Regiment of the 35th Infantry Division. Before long, he found himself in Europe as Allied forces pushed deeper into Nazi-occupied territory, following the invasion of Normandy. Now a staff sergeant, Spurrier was an excellent combat soldier, but his lack of discipline led him to be assigned as a company runner rather than a squad leader. However, this allowed him to be his own man and fight solo missions, which he preferred, as he carried critical messages between battalion headquarters and platoons. Now, one thing that's easy to forget looking back today is just how brutal fighting in Europe actually was by late 1944. Soldiers were exhausted. Cold weather was setting in. Entire villages had become battlefields. German defenses were still incredibly dangerous, especially in heavily fortified areas where machine gun nests in hidden positions could stop an advance almost instantly. And in November of 1944, Spurrier's unit found itself in exactly that kind of situation, near the village of Appalachian, France. German forces had the area heavily defended, and American troops trying to move forward were running into devastating enemy fire. Progress slowed almost immediately. Men were getting pinned down. Machine gun fire swept across the village. Every movement became dangerous. And in the middle of all that chaos, this young mountain boy from Wise County, Virginia, apparently reached a point where he'd simply had enough. Now, before we get into what happened next, it's important to understand something. Stories like this can almost sound exaggerated when you hear them years later, like maybe time turned them into a legend. But much of what happened that day was documented by the soldiers who witnessed it, and later became part of official military records, which only adds to the authenticity of this story. And now, by the time Spurrier had reached Appalachian, France, soldiers around him already knew the young mountain boy from Wise County had a reputation for being fearless in combat. Just a couple of months earlier, near Lake St. Christophe, France, Spurrier climbed onto an American tank destroyer during heavy fighting and used its .50 caliber machine gun to attack German positions while bullets and artillery fire tore across the hillside around him. At one point, he repeatedly jumped off the vehicle itself to attack enemy bunkers with grenades before climbing back aboard and continuing the assault. By the end of that battle, more than 20 German soldiers had surrendered, and Spurrier single-handedly suppressed the enemy so his company could advance. For his actions, he received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military award for heroism. And Spurrier wasn't done yet. Because what Junior did next became one of the most unbelievable acts of battlefield courage to come out of Appalachia during World War II. On November 13th, 1944, American forces were trying to push into the French village of Appalachian when everything stalled out under heavy German fire. Machine gun nests were dug into defensive positions around the village, and every attempt to move forward was getting hammered almost immediately. Men were pinned down in open areas. Bullets were cutting across the roads and fields, and the longer the soldiers stayed trapped in those positions, the worse things were becoming. And at that point, Junior Spurrier decided he was done waiting. As the company was attacking from the east, at 2 p.m., Spurrier grabbed a Browning automatic rifle and stuffed himself with grenades and began moving alone to attack the Germans from the west. That's right, all by his lonesome. Now picture that for a second. Cold November weather in France, gunfire echoing across the village, soldiers pinned down behind cover, and this young man from the mountains of southwestern Virginia suddenly charging directly into heavily defended enemy positions all by himself. Spurrier began fighting his way from position to position through the village, attacking German strongholds one after another. He knocked out the machine gun nest, fired into enemy positions at close range, threw grenades into fortified areas, used whatever weapons he could find along the way, and kept the attack going. The German soldiers believed multiple American troops had somehow entered the village because of how aggressive the attack was, and all along, the fighting was being carried out by one man, Junior Spurrier. By the time darkness fell upon the French countryside, the fighting had subsided, and Spurrier himself had killed one German officer, 24 German soldiers, and had captured 4. The enemy defenses had collapsed, and the American advance was able to move forward. For his actions that day, Junior Spurrier was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States, only presented to the deserving. Spurrier was one of 473 men to be awarded that during World War II, and one of only 17 to be awarded the dual honors of the Medal of Honor and the Distinguished Service Cross. 17 men received that honor out of the 16.1 million that had served. After these actions, Spurrier's fellow men called him the One-Man Army. He remained with the unit and was wounded at the Battle of the Bulge, where he received his second Purple Heart. But unlike some wartime heroes who became national celebrities afterwards, Spurrier's life after the war was complicated. Like many combat veterans of that generation, he struggled adjusting to civilian life. Over the years, he worked different jobs, eventually operating a small radio and television repair business before later settling in eastern Tennessee. Junior Spurrier died in 1984 at the age of 61 and is buried at the Mountain Home National Cemetery near Johnson City, Tennessee, and not far from the mountains where his story first began. And there is something about his name I need to mention. His real name was actually James Ira Spurrier Jr., but while joining the Army, on his official enlistment paperwork, he accidentally filled his name into the wrong spaces, and from then on, the Army officially knew him as Junior J. Spurrier, and honestly, that nickname probably fit him better anyway. And even now, outside military circles, his name still isn't nearly as widely known as some other World War II heroes. But in Appalachia, stories like this still matter, because every now and then, history reaches into a little mountain town and pulls somebody ordinary into something extraordinary. Our next story takes us back into the coal fields of West Virginia, but this time into a part of Appalachian history that honestly doesn't always get talked about as much as it should. Cornelius H. Charlton was born in 1929 in the little mining community of East Gulf, West Virginia, which sits in Raleigh County. And during that time period, life in the Appalachian coal fields could already be hard enough for families trying to survive. But for black Appalachian families living through segregation, life often carried an entirely different set of struggles. Charlton's father worked in the coal mines, like so many men across southern West Virginia during that time. Coal camps were rough places. Families worked long hours, money was tight, and people learned early how quickly life could humble you. Eventually, like many Appalachian families during that time, the Charltons moved north looking for more opportunity. That movement became part of what historians now call the Great Migration, when thousands of African American families left the rural South and Appalachia, searching for work and a different future in industrial cities farther north. But even after leaving West Virginia, those Appalachian roots stayed part of who Cornelius Charlton was. By the time the Korean War broke out in the early 1950s, Charlton had joined the United States Army and was serving as part of Company C, 24th Infantry Regiment, 25th Infantry Division, a Buffalo Soldier Regiment, the last all-black unit remaining in the Army. And one thing that's important to remember here is that America itself was still changing during that period. The military had only recently begun desegregating following President Truman's order in 1948. So, many black servicemen during the Korean War were serving during a time of enormous transition inside the armed forces. And yet, like so many Appalachian soldiers before him, Charlton found himself thousands of miles from home, fighting in a brutal war most Americans today barely even talk about anymore. Now, the Korean War itself often gets called the Forgotten War, but the fighting there was incredibly vicious. Mountain terrain, bitter cold, constant artillery fire, hilltop battles where soldiers sometimes fought over the same ground over and over. And in June of 1951, Cornelius Charlton and his fellow soldiers found themselves caught in one of those battles during an assault against heavily defended enemy positions in Korea. As Charlton's unit advanced towards the enemy positions, they suddenly came under intense fire from Chinese forces dug into fortified bunkers along the hillside. His platoon leader was wounded and evacuated, leaving Sergeant Charlton in command. As machine gun fire and grenades continued tearing through the American assault, he rallied the men and led an assault up the hill where he personally eliminated 2 positions and killed 6 enemy soldiers. Suffering heavy casualties, his unit became pinned down, and once again, Sergeant Charlton regrouped his men and continued up the hill, only to be forced back down again by numerous enemy grenades. During this assault, however, Charlton suffered a severe chest wound, refused medical attention, and continued a third assault to charge the crest of the hill. Even after being hit, Charlton continued leading his men forward up the hill while enemy fire poured down around them. At one point, he charged directly towards one of the bunkers firing on his unit and destroyed it with grenades. Then, he kept advancing towards another enemy position, further up the slope. Now, when you hear these stories of Medal of Honor recipients, they can almost start sounding impossible. But the thing that stands out in so many of them is not that these people weren't afraid. It's that somewhere in the middle of fear and chaos and pain, they kept moving anyway. And that's exactly what Charlton did. Even after suffering additional wounds during the assault, he continued pressing uphill against enemy defenses while trying to encourage the men around him to keep fighting. Witnesses later described him repeatedly exposing himself to enemy fire while attacking bunker after bunker. And during the final assault on another enemy position, Cornelius Charlton was killed. He was only 21 years old. For his actions that day, Charlton was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, becoming one of the first African American soldiers to receive the nation's highest military decoration for the Korean War. And like so many stories tied to Appalachia, there's a sadness in realizing how many people probably still don't know his name today. A young man born in the coalfields of West Virginia, the son of a coal miner who carried himself into one of the deadliest places on earth and never came home. Cornelius Charlton was buried 3 times. First at Pocahontas, Virginia, then in Beckley, West Virginia, and eventually he was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, where his grave now rests among the thousands of other Americans who carried war with him to the very end. And that almost seems fitting, in that those 3 burials might signify the 3 assaults he led on that hill in Korea. And maybe that's what Memorial Day is supposed to pull us back to. Not just the famous names everybody already knows, but the ordinary people from little communities from all across this country whose story can slip away if somebody doesn't stop long enough to remember them. Our next story takes us into the mountains of western North Carolina, into the community of Birdtown, located in the Qualla boundary, often referred to as the Cherokee Indian Reservation, where Charles George was born in 1932. And if you've ever spent any time around that part of Appalachia, you know it's a place where the mountains seem to close in all around you. Rivers cut through the valleys. Mountain fog hangs low over the trees, where you can see the blue smoke of the mountains. Families there carry traditions and stories that stretch back long before the United States even existed. Charles grew up in that world. He was a member of the Bird Clan of the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Indians, and by most accounts, he lived a pretty simple mountain life growing up. He hunted, fished the cold rivers and creeks around the Smoky Mountains, spent time outdoors, and like a lot of young men from Appalachia during that generation, he grew up understanding responsibility early. Now, one thing that stands out in stories about Charles George is how connected he was to the people around him. In small mountain communities, especially back then, people often grew up together, almost like extended family. Friends weren't just classmates or neighbors. They were people you'd known your whole life. And eventually, Charles George entered military service during the Korean War. Now, by the early 1950s, the Korean Peninsula had turned into another brutal conflict zone. Bitter winters, mountain fighting, long nights under constant threat of enemy attacks, and once again, thousands of American soldiers found themselves fighting and dying in rugged terrain far away from home. And honestly, there's something eerie about how often mountain people from Appalachia ended up fighting in mountain terrain overseas. Different countries, different wars, but still cold ridges, narrow valleys, steep hillsides, and difficult ground. And in November of 1952, Charles George and his fellow soldiers found themselves preparing for one of those terrifying nighttime battles inside Korea, just north of the capital city of Seoul. As darkness settled over the hills, Charles George and the other soldiers around him moved into position as fighting erupted around them. They were members of a raiding party that was assigned to take a prisoner for interrogation. And like so many battles during the Korean War, confusion and chaos took over quickly once the shooting started. Gunfire echoing across the hillsides, mortars exploding around the American position. Soldiers were trying to hold their ground while enemy troops pushed closer through the darkness. And during the middle of that fighting, Charles George was positioned in a trench line where he engaged the enemy in hand-to-hand combat with 2 other soldiers. And then it happened. An enemy grenade landed directly inside the trench where George and the 2 others were positioned. There wasn't time to throw it back. there wasn't time to run. Charles George yelled a warning and pushed one of the soldiers out of the way, and immediately threw himself on top of the grenade, absorbing the explosion with his own body. The blast severely wounded him, but the men beside him survived. And even after suffering those injuries, George remained conscious and still refused to let out any cries of pain so as not to give away the position to the enemy. Just 20 years old. That's one of those details that's hard to fully process sometimes. A young Cherokee man from the mountains of North Carolina, barely old enough to really begin adult life, making a decision in a split second that saves the lives of his fellow soldiers while costing his own. Charles George died from his wounds not long afterwards. For his actions that night, he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. And his story became one of the most honored military stories connected to the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Indians and Appalachia as a whole. Today, Charles George is buried at Yellow Hill Cemetery in Cherokee, North Carolina, not far from the mountains, rivers, and community where his story first began. The VA Medical Center in Asheville, North Carolina, is named in his honor. And honestly, maybe that's the part of what makes stories like this stay with people for so long. Because behind all the medals and military honors, this was still somebody's son, somebody's friend, somebody who grew up fishing mountain streams and living an ordinary life until history suddenly demanded something extraordinary from him. And as we move into our final story, it's the late 1950s. The world had changed again. World War II was over. Korea had slowed into an uneasy armistice. But now another kind of war had settled across the globe. One fought less in trenches and more through secrets, surveillance, espionage, and the constant fear that nuclear war could break out at any moment. And tied to all that was a young man from the Appalachian coalfields named Francis Gary Powers. Powers was born in 1929 in Burdine, Kentucky, in Letcher County, before his family eventually moved to southwestern Virginia, where he grew up in Pound, Virginia, and later attended school in Grundy, Virginia. He grew up where people worked hard and opportunities could sometimes feel limited unless you found a way beyond the mountains. And for Gary Powers, that path eventually became flying. After joining the United States Air Force, Powers quickly developed a reputation as a talented pilot. And in 1956, during the height of the Cold War, he was recruited by the CIA into one of the most secretive programs in the entire United States government. Now, during this period, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were dangerously high. Both countries were racing to build intercontinental nuclear missiles. Each side feared the other might launch an attack with little warning, and American intelligence officials desperately wanted information about Soviet military capabilities, missile sites, and nuclear development. And that's where the U-2 spy plane came in. The aircraft itself almost sounded unbelievable. It could fly at extremely high altitudes, far above where most people believed enemy defenses could reach. And pilots like Gary Powers were tasked with flying deep over Soviet territory, taking photographs of military installations that American leaders considered critical to national security. But the missions carried enormous risk, because if anything went wrong, these pilots weren't just risking being shot down, they risked triggering an international crisis between two nuclear superpowers. On May 1st, 1960, Gary Powers took off in his U-2 spy plane on what was supposed to be another high-altitude surveillance mission deep inside Soviet airspace. Missions like this had already been carried out before, and he himself had been flying these missions for over 4 years. American officials believed the aircraft could still fly high enough to avoid being intercepted. But this time was different. While flying over the Soviet Union, Powers' aircraft was struck by a newly developed Soviet surface-to-air missile. The explosion damaged the plane badly, and suddenly, this young man from the Appalachian coalfields found himself falling thousands of feet through hostile airspace during one of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War. Powers survived the crash and was captured by the Soviet authorities almost immediately. And once that happened, the entire situation exploded into an international crisis. At first, the United States tried to claim the aircraft had simply been a weather research plane that had drifted off course. But then Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev revealed that Gary Powers was still alive and in custody, along with pieces of the aircraft and surveillance equipment recovered from the crash. And now, the whole world knew. The incident shattered an important diplomatic meeting between the United States and the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, Gary Powers found himself at the center of it all. He was eventually convicted of espionage inside the Soviet Union and sentenced to 10 years in prison and hard labor camps. But after nearly 2 years in captivity, Powers was released in 1962 as part of a famous Cold War prisoner exchange on a bridge between East and West Berlin. Now, most people would probably assume somebody returning home after surviving all of that would immediately be treated like a hero. But for Gary Powers, things were more complicated. Some critics questioned why he hadn't destroyed the aircraft completely. Others accused him of not resisting enough after being captured, and for also not using the poison pen concealed inside a silver dollar he had in his possession that was for him to take his own life. Imagine the weight of that. A young man from the Appalachian coalfields flying missions so secretive and dangerous that the government had already considered the possibility he might never come home alive, or might have to make an impossible decision if he was captured. And for years, Powers carried the weight of public suspicion and political controversy despite the reality that he had survived circumstances most people could hardly imagine. And honestly, that part of the story feels important too. Because not every person who serves their country comes home to parades and praise. Sometimes they come home carrying burdens most people around them will never fully understand. For years, there were those who questioned whether Gary Powers had done enough to resist after his capture. But decades later, after more Cold War information became declassified in the late 1990s, government reviews and released intelligence records strongly supported that Powers had followed protocol, never denounced the United States, and did not provide damaging intelligence to the Soviet Union, despite intense interrogation and enormous pressure brought on by his captors. Many historians later argued he had handled the situation remarkably well under impossible circumstances. In later years, Powers worked as a pilot and eventually as a helicopter reporter for a television station in California. But in 1977, tragedy struck again when his helicopter crashed near Los Angeles during a news assignment. Gary Powers was killed at the age of 47. A boy born in the Appalachian coalfields who became one of the most recognizable figures of the Cold War ended up buried at Arlington National Cemetery among generations of American servicemen and women whose lives became tied to war, sacrifice, and history. And if you've ever seen the Steven Spielberg thriller, Bridge of Spies, well, now you know who the movie was about. And maybe that's one of the strangest things about Appalachia sometimes. People from these little mountain towns and quiet hollers somehow keep finding themselves in the middle of some of the biggest moments in world history. And the truth is, these stories really only scratch the surface. Because for every Ruby Bradley, Junior Sperrier, Cornelius Charlton, Charles George, or Gary Powers, there are 1,000 more names scattered across Appalachia that most people outside these mountains will never hear. Names carved into courthouse memorials. Names written on folded flags sitting inside living rooms. Names carried quietly by families for generations. And the thing is, it never really stopped. Appalachia kept sending its sons and daughters into war long after World War II, Korea, and the Cold War ended. Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan. Different wars, different generations. But the same mountain towns continue to answer the call over and over again. People like Jessica Lynch, the young soldier from Palestine, West Virginia, who was wounded and captured during the Iraq War, later receiving the Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and Prisoner of War Medal after surviving one of the conflict's most widely known incidents. Or Staff Sergeant Gregory Pennington from southwestern Virginia, who was killed in Baghdad in 2004 while helping evacuate fellow soldiers during a mortar attack. A decorated Special Forces soldier who had received medals, including the Bronze Star and Purple Heart. And all across Appalachia today, there are still families with children, husbands, wives, brothers, sisters, mothers, and fathers serving in the military right now. Maybe that's part of why Memorial Day feels personal in so many mountain communities. Because around Appalachia, military service was never just something people watched on television. It was the boy you grew up with, the girl you went to school with, the neighbor whose photograph still hangs in somebody's hallway, the folded flag handed to a family standing beside a grave. And maybe that's what ties all these stories together more than anything else. Not fame, not medals, not politics, just ordinary people from small Appalachian communities who, when history demanded something from them, they gave more than most people ever could. Some came home carrying scars nobody could see, and some never came home at all. So this Memorial Day, as people gather with family, visit cemeteries, have a cookout, travel, or simply enjoy a quiet day off work, take a moment to remember the people behind the names, the stories behind the uniforms, and the Appalachian families who, generation after generation, kept sending pieces of themselves into wars far away from these mountains. Because in the end, Memorial Day isn't really about the wars, it's about the people. People from little Appalachian towns and hollers who carried the weight of history on their shoulders, and in some cases, never made it back home to the mountains that raised them. And long after the uniforms fade and the battlefields grow quiet, their stories still remain, woven into the roots of Appalachia and forever resting in its shadows. This has been Roots and Shadows, the Real Appalachia podcast, where every root tells a story and every shadow hides one. As a reminder, these stories are drawn from public records, historical reporting, and conversations passed down through families, neighbors, and memories. Some names have been changed, and where the written record goes quiet, details have been carefully dramatized for storytelling.